Good afternoon, and welcome back to Story Time with me, your host, Jenelle Schmidt. There we go. I think that's working now. Good afternoon. Sorry, it's back to that I think Facebook is in the middle of turning over from their old live interface to their new one, and so they won't let me use the old one anymore. Sadness. Anyway, I'm back for story time with He Whistles for the Cricket by Gwen Walker. This is a family-friendly story that is safe and appropriate for all ages, so grab your kids, grab something to drink, grab a warm blanket, curl up on the couch, and welcome. And I hope that you enjoy this episode of Storytime. Chapter 12 is called Faith. The crowbar was returned to the special hook in the Olney garage, and Hank Zender continued to work for Mr. Olney after school and on weekends. It was not long before Mr. Olney felt free to leave him in charge, as he had the day he had gone for the Greens and the Johnsons at the fair in Redney. The trust was not misplaced, and Hank did not lord it over his classmates who stopped by for air for their tires or for a small repair job or piece of advice they needed. Kitty Corner from the Washington Elementary School was Faith's house. She was a school friend of Miriam's, and when the children would get off the bus, Miriam would walk over to Faith's house and spend the 20 minutes before the first school bell with Faith. Faith could easily leave once she heard the bell. The children who live nearest school are the most likely ones to be late for school each day, but not so with Faith. She never got there late. She never got there early, either. Faith kept herself remote from most of the classroom activities and friendships, other than to do her work. She was an average student in her grades, and never was faulted for not having her homework. But she never brought a permission slip to go on a field trip. The teacher would even tell her she would wait and let Faith run home, but Faith said, very politely, no, thank you. She would just go to the library. This is what students who forgot their slips or who had doctor's appointments had to do if the class was going somewhere. Faith never had a doctor's appointment or a dentist appointment, and she never missed school. But she never went on a field trip or a class party. Miriam knew the reason why. There was always a small charge for the transportation and for milk, usually 20 cents. Faith did not have 20 cents, and though her mother might have found a way of coming up with it, Miriam knew Faith didn't ask her. Miriam knew this when, in a moment of quiet exchange of confidences which their friendship allowed, Faith had told her. Miriam could have paid Faith's way. Her salary for working for Mrs. Cheney continued, and afforded her many little things the previous years had denied her. She had offered Faith the money, and Faith was not offended, but she did not accept it, telling Miriam she would have her own one day soon, and she didn't like to borrow. Miriam had told her it would be a gift, but Faith said, no, thank you, and that was the end of it. But it did not hurt their friendship. Miriam and Faith got along well. It was strange, because Faith did not talk easily to anyone, but in Miriam she had a special friend who accepted her with so little interchange. Miriam had learned to spend long, long hours alone in the summer days, and also in the after-school hours before her parents would return from work, and when Jeff was in the fields working. Having Moses as an almost constant companion, with his attentive ears and unquestioning approval, Miriam seemed to have developed the ability of accepting Faith on the terms with which Moses accepted her. She did long to know more of Faith, as she herself grew in the self-consciousness which parallels a growing awareness of others. When Miriam went to Faith's house in the morning, Faith would greet her at the door with a shy smile of welcome. Usually she was just finishing dressing, and Miriam would sit at the kitchen table with her, while her mother would set out cereal, a cereal bowl and spoon, and the gallon of milk which was awkward to pour from, but manageable with 2 hands. She would ask Miriam if she didn't want to have a bowl of cereal, too, and sometimes, after the long bus ride, Miriam would have a small second breakfast with Faith. Faith's mother did not eat with them, and Miriam wondered about that. The Greens ate their meals together most every morning and night, and it was a way of life. Faith's household did things differently. Faith's mother, Mrs. Vitale, always welcomed Miriam with a gush of enthusiasm, as though trying to balance the quiet of her own daughter. She talked for Faith when Faith seemed to have nothing to say, but it was a warm and well-intentioned covering of the gap. Sometimes it seemed as though she were afraid Miriam would stop coming, and she seemed to know how very important it was in her own little girl's life that she had a friend. Miriam, apparently, was the only friend Faith had, and so she was a treasure to Mrs. Vitale, devoutly to be cherished. Her flurry of activity and words about them was selfless rather than banal, and both girls sensed this. Miriam and Faith would carry their bowls to the sink, and one of them would put the milk away. Then Miriam would watch in the bathroom door while Faith brushed her teeth and gave her hair a quick combing. They would gather up their books, and Mrs. Vitale would give them each a hug goodbye. Faith would kiss her mother's cheek, the last thing before the two girls ran across the street to the schoolyard. "Does your mom work, Faith?" Miriam asked her when they were first getting acquainted. "Yes, after I leave," she had answered. Miriam didn't ask where. Parents worked. When she was younger, she thought her father worked papers and that her mother helped him. She didn't know much about offices and catalog houses before 5th grade, and the Weekly Reader somehow introduced her to the wider adult world of work and wages. She did like the atmosphere of Mrs. Vitale being there in the morning when Faith was getting ready for school. It was like Saturdays and Sundays when she knew Mrs. Green was there in the house, no matter what she herself was doing. There was a real solid sense of security on those days, though they had all adjusted to the routine of weekdays as they were growing up. Miriam could remember how it had been before her mother started to work, and the strange wistfulness about those mornings washed over her at Faith's house. This was one of the initial threads weaving her friendship with Faith, and the camaraderie of their early morning time together followed naturally. Mrs. Petak taught the 6th grade. She was cordial to most, friendly to a few, and stiffish in her attitude toward Faith. Miriam learned from her, but tried to keep out of her line of scrutiny most of the time. She was different from most of the teachers which Miriam had had in the past. Mr. Heilman had taught 5th grade, and the students laughed in his classroom and found it a good place to be. He had a way of joshing with them that made them all feel accepted, even if they came to school with 2 different color socks on like Abe did. Mr. Heilman pointed it out and made everyone look and laugh, but almost right away he walked over and pulled up his own pants legs long enough for the kids to see that he had done the same thing. He put out his hand to Abe and said, "Welcome, brother," and everyone had a good laugh on both of them. Nobody laughed in Mrs. Petak's class, unless it was behind her back and under their breaths. It seemed like it was going to be a countdown year until the end of May. Mrs. Petak did not like Faith. Of course, there was no statement to substantiate this truth, but it was implicit in everyone's understanding. The first day, when she had asked Faith a question, and Faith did not answer right away, Mrs. Petak seemed to take it as a personal insult and asked sharply for Faith to sit down. Faith sat, without trying to explain that she knew the answer, but that she was not quick with words. Before the inertia first-day fear of a new class and new teacher could be overcome in Faith's slow way, Mrs. Petak had made her conclusion. The year before, Mr. Heilman had loved teaching the Weekly Reader to the class, best of all. He talked about the Great Depression of the early 30s, when these students of his had been in kindergarten or 1st grade. Now, he told them with relish, they were able to understand what it was all about. It was in these discussions that Miriam was better able to understand the financial stress of her early childhood years, and how difficult it must have been for her parents. When Mr. Heilman asked the class if they could remember any incidents which would have related to those difficult years, she told everyone about how she had wanted a dog back then, but that her family couldn't afford it. Then she told about Moses and how it was that she was able to take care of him with her part-time work. She was surprised at her own boldness, and it opened up the conversation for many other offerings. Tom remembered that there were never any desserts, and Abe told that his dad had been out of work for a long time. He couldn't remember how long. Mr. Heilman took in all their observances and made them feel comfortable and adult and aware of hard things, and a togetherness they shared in these things. Faith had contributed nothing to the conversation, but she listened and was very much included. Then Mr. Heilman told them about his own mother's school-teaching days 20-some years before that. The Great Depression was bad, he told them. But that isn't the only time things were hard. Things were more frightening in the Great Depression because they were so unpredictable. There wasn't any assurance that if you worked hard and saved, you would be able to pay your bills and feed your family. Men did that and lost their homes anyway. People used their savings, and finally the banks closed, and others who had saved lost all their savings. 1/4 of our working people didn't have work, and that's hard. Times for my mother weren't like that, but people were poor in a different sort of way, without the mass fear, not knowing what you could count on. Maybe expectations weren't so high then either. Let me tell you about a little farm boy who came to my mom's class, he enticed them, and they set their pencils down in the slot at the head of their desks and almost imperceptibly gave him their full attention. Stories, especially true ones, were the best part of the school day. My mother taught in this one-room schoolhouse, just like you read about, he told them. Truly, the kids wore shoes in the bad weather only. The little pot-bellied stove had to be stoked with wood or coal on cold mornings, and the kids gathered around with their lunch pails. That's what they were, pails, he assured them in response to their looks of incredulity. Miriam thought of her newspaper-wrapped lunch and how she had often envied the kids with neat little brown sacks which had to be purchased. Better than a pail, she thought. Mr. Heilman continued, slowly dragging his audience aback with him to the schoolroom they could begin to see and smell and hear. Pails set on the floor next to wooden type pew benches. Wood being carried to the stove. A bell clanging to announce the day. Well, Jimmy, I don't know what his last name was the poorest of them all. He had a lunch pail, but sometimes all it had in it was a couple of apples, and that's not very satisfying for a hungry boy. Think of it. What if you all knew that the only thing you were going to get between now and supper time was an apple or two? The boys groaned, but one of the girls said that would be okay with her. Yes, Mr. Heilman agreed. Perhaps so. But that's because you can go home to a big supper and stoke up, just like stoking up the stove. He smiled and invited her agreement. She laughed, agreeing, and a few supper favorites were thrown into the conversation. Well, Jimmy had his apples, and once in a while a slice of bread. Plain. That was all. My mother knew he was hungry most of the time, and she would bring something extra for him, but it was awkward trying not to draw attention to him. Miriam wanted to look at Faith, and she did look over a little, but Faith was fixed on Mr. Heilman and his story. So she invited him home to her house for lunch one day. This was before she got married and had me to feed, he emphasized. She fixed a real feast. Fried chicken she had fried up the night before, potato salad, cornbread with hot apple butter. The kids were groaning deliciously and licking their lips as Mr. Heilman embellished the fare set before Jimmy. Well, my mom has told me many times Jimmy ate as though he just couldn't get enough. And to top things off, she brought out one of those deep dish apple pies. He paused, waiting for the class to groan their appreciation with new exclamations. Well, Jimmy just looked at that thing, and my mom cut him about 1/4 of it. It was running all over with cinnamon and butter, and the flaky kind of crust that tastes better than the pie itself, you know? They all knew. Jimmy ate that piece of pie and sat there with his thumbs holding out his belt to make more room, and he looked as though he was going to try and fit in another piece, if only she would ask. But it was time for them to get back to school for the afternoon. She only lived a short walk to the schoolhouse and could have come home to eat every day, but mostly she stayed and ate with her students. She told him they had to go, and he looked so disappointed that she said, Why, Jimmy, how about taking a piece along with you for after school? And she was intending to cut a piece and wrap it up when he looked at her and said, Can I? Before she could even finish saying sure, he had that other 1/4 of the pie scooped into his pocket with his bare hand. Mr. Heilman smiled at the class at the remembrance. But that wasn't the end of the story. He went on, and they were glad, waiting for the chance to ask the myriad of questions such a history always brings to an excited class. Yep, Jimmy was well fed that day, and he didn't forget it. Before that week was out, he brought his lunch pail up to my mom and told her, I'm bringing your lunch today, Miss Jackson. My mother didn't know quite what to do, knowing how short his family was for food. but she knew that eating the lunch he needed worse than her was the only right thing she could do. He paused to see if the class understood, and they did. He could tell by the solemn looks on their faces. Jimmy was becoming real to them, and they wanted to hear more. She said, "Why, thank you, Jimmy. I'll enjoy it. And you know, it may have been the biggest lie my mother ever told. At lunchtime, he gave her his lunch pail, and she would have been glad for two wizened up little apples, that's for sure, because inside there was a huge hunk of homemade bread. Jimmy had probably cut from the loaf himself, and it was slathered thick with 2 inches of lard." This time the class demonstrated with gags and yucks entirely fitting. He sat and watched her eat that thing as though he were giving her his most precious treasure. And he was, too, Mr. Heilman concluded. And so you see, he told his class, now sobered and edified in their new knowledge of another time and another student and another class. Times were hard for others, too, but some things don't change. What are some of those things, do you think? The discussion opened up and continued for the rest of the afternoon. That day, Faith had talked to Miriam after school and told her that her father had been one of those men who lost all his savings during that depression they had talked about. They had a clothing business, she said, but they lost it. "Miriam, if I tell you something, will you promise never to tell anyone?" Faith asked her, this as they sat together on the porch swing, each pushing with one toe to keep themselves going. Miriam nodded without saying anything, knowing this was a near sacred link in their friendship. Faith had never asked such a thing before, and so she knew it wasn't the sort of secret people entrust loosely to one another. Faith accepted her nod and waited a minute before going on. "My father killed himself," she told Miriam. That was all. She looked at Miriam to see if she had been safe in disclosing this. Miriam suddenly had a look of real grief and only replied after a minute of her own assimilation. "Oh, Faith, I never knew. Oh, I feel so badly for you and your mom." She moved closer on the swing and wanted badly to let Faith know that her confidence was safe and that she was somehow sad but honored that Faith could share this with her. Faith didn't have tears in her eyes, and that helped Miriam go on talking with her about it. Was it still hard for Mrs. Vitale? She wanted to know. Mrs. Vitale never talked about it, Faith told her, but Faith knew it was hard on her. She cried all the time at first, and people came over and didn't know what to say, and Faith just took it all in, missing her father and not understanding. No one said anything right to her, but they talked about her a lot, and someone knew of this house they could stay in near Redney. Some distant relative of theirs owned it. He'd had to close out his farm. The house was just sitting there, and Faith and her mother could stay in it for nothing. Mrs. Vitale had found work in Redney, as Faith had shared in her response to Miriam's question at another time. Now, in their 6th-grade year together, the girls were able to share many more things alone together, which Faith was unable or unwilling to share within her classroom situation. Mr. Heilman had not drawn her out among them, but he had opened a doorway of communication between two friends through the medium of teaching, lecturing, and storytelling. Some of their school year classes would be obliterated in their retrospective chronologies, but 5th grade, and the teacher who hungered to feed the vital minds and hearts nested under his wing for a short 9 months, would remain. Some things of 5th grade would remain also. Mrs. Petak, too, scheduled the weekly reader session the last hour of the day. The students read paragraphs and answered the questions on the back, and then handed them in to be graded. There was no discussion, and little explanation. Once a month, a weekly reader examination was sent. It was made up of 25 questions on current events and weighed heavily in the grading of this course. The terms were difficult, but not above the vocabulary skills of a 6th-grade class, according to the standardized national tests report. Redney County students were well above the national average, Mrs. Petak was quick to assert, if challenged by a concerned parent about the test scores. The students could do well, and the only reason anyone would ever not do well was because most assuredly they had not tried. The 3rd month of the weekly reader examination, after 2 dismal class average outcomes and the accompanying harangue, they put forth great effort. The weekly reader examinations lay on Mrs. Petak's desk, and underneath the Kleenex box lay the key to the test. Jack Stebbins saw it there, and didn't quite know what to do with this piece of information, but it enticed him, until opportunity to use it presented itself in wonderfully lucid manner. Mrs. Petak left the class just before the last hour of the day to get herself a cup of coffee. This she would drink, grading papers, while her students read their weekly readers and answered questions. This day, the moment she left, Jack's leadership gifts asserted themselves. He moved to her desk quickly and slipped the answer key from under the Kleenex box. "I've got the key," he told the class, inviting their participation and leaving little time for moral consideration. "Let's pass it fast and copy down the answers." He assumed the class would, and no one spoke up to insist on the return of the key. Miriam wanted to, but she didn't want to be the one to say. Abe waited for someone else's reaction, as they all did, to a man. Loyalty to each other, fear of exposure, dislike for their teacher, age-old excuses for dishonesty held sway for the brief and hasty moments of passing and copying. Miriam knew she could not copy the answers, and she knew just as well that she could not stand up and tell Jack to put the key away. She didn't know what she was going to do, and was in absolute misery for herself, not even thinking about Faith, who would get the key just before she would. The key had already passed through the hands of 13 of the 21 students in the class. It was slipped quickly onto Faith's desk, and eyes were divided between the doorway of the classroom and Faith. Jack had gone to the pencil sharpener near the door to watch, and he urged everyone to hurry, but so far he had not heard Mrs. Peacock's steps coming around the corner of the hallway perpendicular to their own. Every eye turned from the doorway to Faith when she got up from her desk and went towards Mrs. Peacock's desk. Jack went quickly back to his seat and forgot about watching for Mrs. Peacock. Something more important was happening, and he was not certain of the outcome, or of how his new position might need defending. Faith laid the key back under the Kleenex box, took a Kleenex from the box, and turned back to her seat. At that moment, Mrs. Peacock returned to the room and saw Faith leaving her desk. She looked down at her desk and remembered the key. "Faith, did you have this key?" she asked harshly. She waited for an answer in the stillness of the class with the others. Faith answered slowly. "I came up for a Kleenex, Mrs. Peacock," she said. "You didn't answer my question. I said, did you have the answer key?" Mrs. Peacock waited again, and Faith hesitated with her answer even longer. "Yes, ma'am," she finally answered, looking close to tears, but right at Mrs. Peacock. Mrs. Peacock told her grimly to be seated, and without another word she picked up the weekly reader examinations and passed them out. She did not say another word except, "You may begin," and at the end of the hour she collected the papers and dismissed the class. Miriam knew she had to go to Mrs. Peacock. She felt absolutely miserable for everyone, but the way she felt about what Faith had done and how she had been treated took preeminence over everything. She stayed in her desk, but Faith came to her with a look of real anguish which Miriam couldn't ignore. "Can I see you a minute, Miriam, please?" she implored her, and Miriam went outside with her. "Please don't say anything, Miriam, please." This time Faith was crying, and Miriam felt more helpless than she had in the class. "But why, Faith? I've got to. It isn't fair. You're the only one who did the right thing." Miriam's troubled response came through her own tears. She felt dirty and troubled for herself and for the class, and angry with Mrs. Peacock, and somehow telling the truth for Faith's sake would have helped, in spite of Jack and her own involvement. But Faith wouldn't let her. "She won't believe you anyway. She doesn't like me, and wouldn't ever believe me or anything good about me," Faith whispered, and it was too sad a fact for Miriam to want to accept. "Even if she doesn't, she has to be told the truth," Miriam still insisted. Even so, she had to have Faith's permission. Their friendship was based on trust, and she could not break Faith's trust in her. "You've got to let me, Faith," she urged. Faith said, "At least not now, okay?" She seemed to realize Miriam's own dilemma now, and they left together, hand in hand. They sat on the porch swing for a while, and Miriam asked Faith if she would like to come over sometime and meet Moses. Faith said she would love to, and they would ask their mothers that night. They did not talk about the test at all. The following afternoon, Mrs. Peacock returned the tests and told the class that there had been 3 perfect papers, 8 B's, 6 C's, 2 D's, 2 F's, and 1 0. Everyone looked over at Faith, who looked straight ahead, trembling. Miriam looked too, and saw Faith's lip quiver. Nothing more was said until the students had looked over their papers and adjusted to their successes or failures. Faith looked down at her paper quietly, then up to Mrs. Peacock. Then Mrs. Peacock walked to the podium and addressed the class. "Yesterday, class, my answer key was taken." She paused, though she already had their complete attention. She went on as though deliberating on just how she would handle the situation. Just now, she went on, I think I know what you were all thinking, and I let you do that for a minute. I hope I can help you all to learn something that I think I have just been learning for the first time myself. Mrs. Petak's mouth trembled, and the defenses of her students were jarred considerably. I want to talk to you about heroism, she went on, more controlled. I let you believe for a minute that it was Faith Vitale who received the 0. Am I right? She waited for the class to give her some sort of a response, and there were enough nods to assure her of this. I thought so, she said quietly. But it is not Faith who received the 0. It is Jack Stebbins. They all looked to him in surprise, and he reddened, expecting their looks. Mrs. Petak went on. Faith, she said, has been misjudged by me, without a defense. The class was shocked by the unprecedented admission. They were tense and silent. Will you forgive me, Faith? She then asked. Faith could not say a word. She cupped her face in her hands and nodded up and down to assure Mrs. Petak of her forgiveness. Her face was wet with tears, and she could not hide them, try as she might. She desperately needed another Kleenex, but would never have gotten up to get one in the circumstances. Miriam knew how soggy and wet she was feeling, and she looked over from her to Mrs. Petak in a love for her teacher she had never felt she could have. Mrs. Petak nodded to Miriam and extended the Kleenex box to her, who came up and took out several tissues. She returned to her seat and passed them quietly to Faith. It is heroic to do what is right when all around you are doing what is wrong, Mrs. Petak went on. Now she was, for the first time, the humbled teacher rather than the penitent. Faith was heroic in what she did yesterday. What Jack Stebbins did started out as wrong, but he made it right. He came to me and told me the straight story. Though what he did was wrong, I respect him for what he did in the middle of things. It was Jack who showed me what I needed to do, too. He did wrong, but he made it right. He was guilty. You all did wrong. You were his accomplices. This is your time to make things right. I was the unfair judge, and I must try to make things right. Faith, she paused, did what was right from the beginning. She was the accused. Kipling talked about her in a poem called If. I'll read that to you at another time. But I want you to remember this, for I always shall. She finished in humility, but also in a new strength. She looked then at Jack and nodded almost imperceptibly, as she had when she extended the Kleenex box to Miriam. Jack stood up to speak. It was wrong for me to steal the key, he said, and didn't hedge at the word steal. But it was worse seeing Faith get in trouble for me. Funny thing, the 0 is kind of a relief. The class laughed in a similar relief of tension, and Mrs. Petak laughed with them for the first time, too. Well, I hope you don't always think so, Jack, she cautioned then. I think maybe we need to work together on these examinations a little more. Perhaps we can find out together what the trouble is. A memorized answer key will change your grade, but knowledge will change your life. With that, she had them open to the article on Franklin Delano Roosevelt and read the first paragraph out loud while they followed in their own papers. Before she could begin the second paragraph, Jack Stebbins had his hand raised to ask what the New Deal was, and Tom Johnson interrupted to answer. Faith rode the bus home with Miriam that Friday after school, with permission to stay the weekend. Moses had an extra voice and 2 more little hands to caress his crooning head and make over him with all the fuss and attention which constituted the frosting of his life for 2 whole days. Thanks for joining me, and I will be back tomorrow.